Hey you, have you ever wanted to own a hoodie or t-shirt of a giant mushroom bonking a knight on the head? Well, you're in luck because I finally have an official merch store, and I have exactly that. I really love how this design came out, so if you're interested, check it out. Anyway, here's the video. In Elden Ring, there are 3 different weight classes: light, medium, and heavy. But there's actually a 4th weight class that all players tend to avoid: overloaded. This is the state that results from going over your maximum equip load. While overloaded, you can't run, you can't dodge, and you can't jump. You even suffer a penalty to stamina recovery for good measure. For obvious reasons, you're not meant to actually play the game this way. So that's exactly what I did. Can you beat Elden Ring while over your maximum equip load? Let's find out. First, I chose the Vagabond class since it has solid starting armor and a good overall stat distribution for vigor, endurance, strength, and dexterity. All important stats for this run. Then I got in the game. I didn't have enough gear to begin in an overloaded state, so I just edited my save file to give myself 2 heavy weapons to equip but not actually use so I could push my equip load past the limit. This seemed like the least intrusive way of handicapping myself before finding more gear. Then I died to the tutorial boss, arrived in Limgrave, and began my very slow walk toward the Gatefront ruins. For the rest of the video, I'm going to cut most of this out, but it's hard to overstate just how slow walking around is. If you're an impatient person, attempting this run would be a nightmare, but I managed to reach a sort of calm zen state early on. Anyway, I reached the site of grace, spoke to Melina, and unlocked leveling and my horse. Now here was a key moment. Should I use my horse? If I did, I don't think any of you would really complain. It's not breaking any rules, and surely it would be insane to expect me to just walk everywhere, right? Well, I made the decision to not use my horse unless it was absolutely necessary to progress. The reason for this was 1, it would make me suffer more, and that would be kind of funny, and 2, not having a horse while being forced to walk would dramatically change encounters in the overworld. For example, this encounter right next to me leading up the hill. There are 4 archers and a giant that jumps down. Normally you can just run past these guys on your horse and it's no big deal. But now, this is a whole ass boss fight. I'm getting shot at while a giant walks toward me. I can't outrun it. I can't dodge. Oh my god, why was I doing this? First, I decided my best course of action would be to pull the giant away from the other enemies, so I slowly backed up while blocking a barrage of arrows alongside the giant's own attacks. Once I was far enough away from the archers, I could fight the giant properly as a one-on-one boss encounter. Naturally, my main combat options were blocking every attack and then swinging my sword when I thought it was safe. I had to carefully watch every move, and my openings for dealing damage were slimmer than normal as the time it took me to walk toward the giant after an attack was much slower than normal. This fight also illustrates one of the interesting quirks of blocking. If you don't have enough stamina to block an attack, oftentimes you're still able to block it, but you'll get the stagger animation where your shield flies to the side and you have to wait a few moments before you can act again. Despite the giant having many big attacks in quick succession, I was able to block most of them by taking advantage of this quirk. Anyway, I eventually got him and walked back up to get the archers that were shooting at me. Even a task as simple as this wasn't trivial. Blocking would cause my character to stop moving, so I had to inch my way along the left side to avoid some arrows so I could make progress without getting stun locked into blocking. I took them all out and kept walking up the path. There were still more enemies though. I'd never paid any of these guys even the slightest bit of respect on my other playthroughs, but now I had to. For instance, these Warhammer guys were kind of a big deal. I didn't realize that a single attack from them could break my guard. This coupled with the other enemies caused me to die on my first attempt up the hill. The next time I decided to just time my attack before theirs so I didn't need to block. So I took them out, killed the stragglers, and dealt with the wolves that fell out of the sky. After all that, I'd made it up a small hill in the overworld that normally takes players about 30 seconds on horseback. For obvious reasons, I won't be going into detail for every encounter in the game like this, but I wanted to highlight just how much being overloaded without a horse could evolve a normal encounter to something that demanded my full attention. Just up the hill, there was another group of enemies. Here's another fun quirk. An enemy spotting me and blowing their horn was suddenly a big deal. Getting swarmed by a dozen enemies without being able to run away or recover was brutal, and I died pretty quickly. On my second attempt, I was spotted again, but I backed up slowly this time. Due to how their AI is programmed, only a couple would actively try hitting me at a time. This is intentional on FromSoft's part to help mitigate getting truly overwhelmed in large groups of enemies. And it was enough for me to survive and work my way to the tunnel. Now I knew I wouldn't be strong enough to actually defeat Margaret at this point, but I was still curious to see how much I could do. It went pretty terribly. I barely put a dent in his health bar. Occasionally I'd be able to block more than one attack that broke my guard in a row, but for the most part it was impossible to block his long attack chains that left no room for recovering stamina. Like I mentioned earlier, being overloaded greatly reduced my stamina recovery speed, and I was definitely feeling that here. Luckily, there were quite a few ways I could get stronger to deal with this fight, so it was back to the overworld. I made the long trek over to the Third Church of America to grab the Sacred Tear there. My goal at this point was to continue finding a few more Sacred Tears and Golden Seeds in Limgrave while I picked up other items to help me out. My next destination was in Southern Limgrave, and to get there I needed to cross this bridge. Again, this is another encounter that barely registers as a challenge when you have a horse or the ability to dodge. But this time, oh no. The ballista was the real issue here, and it would lock onto me, fire a bolt, and then that bolt would explode. The initial hit could be blocked, but the explosion could not given my current stamina and shield. I'd also get launched backwards, so negative progress was made whenever I got hit. I found a clever solution though. If I positioned myself just right, the ballista would hit this flag in the ground instead of me. And very luckily, this flag was not a destructible object, so it could be hit repeatedly. This allowed me to walk forward until I could move to the right and out of the ballista's field of view. It probably sounds ridiculous to some of you, but this was really exciting to do. The game was not designed to be played like this, so it was never a given if I could actually make progress with these self-imposed rules. Therefore, every small victory felt that much bigger, like I was defying Miyazaki himself in some meaningless way. Anyway, I kept pushing south until I reached this broken carriage. It had a morning star in the back, and I wanted this for later. I just needed to hop up, and I can't jump. No jumping meant no bleed weapon for me. This was a bit of a startling reminder on how important the jump button was. Some items and areas were simply off limits to me because FromSoft understandably designed them with jumping in mind. Another early bleed weapon was the flail, but this too was stuck in a carriage chest that I wasn't able to reach. Moving on from that setback, the real reason I came south was for this boss fight with the Knight's Cavalry that appears here at night. I was still using an unupgraded weapon, so this was a bit tricky. I relied a lot on guard counters to get damage in. Eventually I knocked him off his horse, got the kill, and received my reward, the Ash of War for Barricade Shield. This is a skill you can put on shields that dramatically increases the guard boost of the shield for 6 seconds after using it. The higher the guard boost on a shield, the bigger the attacks you can block. Basically, a higher guard boost means that blocking will consume less stamina. I wanted to see how much this would help me, so I went straight back to Margit for round 2. It helped, but not that much. Attacks were still outright breaking my guard, and I was still getting overwhelmed by chains of attacks. Barricade Shield wasn't going to be enough on its own. Next stop, Caelid. To reach Caelid, I took the teleporter next to the Third Church of America. My goal was on the other side of this bridge, and normally I just ride my horse past the dragon. I was still committed to just walking though, so I wanted to see how that would go. Not great. I could still make my way across though if I took the side path underneath, so I did exactly that and reached the next site of grace. To continue, I needed to keep walking down this path. One problem though, there's a giant metal ball that would appear out of nowhere and run me over. Like most giant balls in FromSoft games, this killed me instantly. I would need to find a way to avoid this. I managed to do that by walking along the left edge of this path. This let me skip the giant ball entirely. Further along the path, I also had a near-death experience with a second ball that appears. Not even close, I totally wasn't scared there at all. I made a small detour at the bottom of the hill into Dragon Barrow Cave, aka Giant Bear Cave. To get past this bear, I used stealth to hide in the bushes. I wasn't sure if I'd be able to pull this off due to how slow I was, but I just barely made it to safety while the bear patrolled back and forth. My reward at the back of the cave was the Bull Goat's Talisman. This increases poise by 33%, and I thought it might be handy later on if I ever needed to rely on tanking hits. Back outside, I continued along the path until I reached the next site of grace. From here, I wanted to get to the top of the hill. My objective was to reach the site of grace behind the giant screaming dragon at the top. I first attempted to do this by taking the path to the left of the checkpoint. This resulted in me getting swarmed by these poison guys with spears. Given how strong and tanky they were, killing more than one at a time wasn't going to be an option. On my second attempt, I actually managed to stealth my way up pretty far up the path by hanging to the side and avoiding their sight. This unfortunately did not work for the entire time, and I eventually hit a point where I just couldn't avoid them any longer. Once again, I was swarmed and died. Going up that way seemed impossible, so I turned my attention to the right. This would also lead me to my destination, but it involved significantly more dragons. This first dragon was going to be the test. Could I make it past him? I attempted stealth at first, though it became apparent that no, this wasn't going to work. There just wasn't enough room to sneak past. He didn't appreciate my efforts to hide either, and reminded me how gravity works. I had a crazy idea to solve this. What if I just walked past him? Just right down the middle. This actually kind of worked. The dragon moved at about the same pace as my walking, and it didn't have any fire attacks I needed to worry about. Just the occasional swipe or slam that I could fully block. Everything was fine until I ran into a second dragon, and juggling two at once caused me to mess up and get hit by a tail swipe from behind. I wasn't going to give up though. This seemed doable. On my next try, I walked past the dragon, but this time I stayed more to the right to try and avoid the second dragon. This worked, and I moved far enough away from the first dragon's starting point that it faded away. All I had to do was keep moving up the hill and avoid the rest of the dragons. I stayed to the right and tried to hug the fire rock wall. Stealth was necessary at this point, since I'd likely aggro multiple dragons if I was spotted. When I got closer, the giant screaming dragon lived up to its name and woke up the smaller dragons nearby. This created an incredibly tense moment as they started patrolling around searching for me, and getting killed represented several real-life minutes to get back to this point. In the end, I finally made it though. Good stuff. Now the reason I put all this effort into reaching this dragon was so that I could kill it for a bunch of easy runes. I used the spike club as a bleed weapon to kill the dragon quickly, and I got it by farming the large demi-human in the cave on the beach in Limgrave. Bleed does a flat percentage of damage, which meant 13,000 damage per bleed proc. I also popped a gold pickled Foulfoot right before it died, so I'd get a 30% rune boost. This gave me almost 100,000 runes, which was enough to level up my strength to 36. But why did I want 36 strength? Well, it was for the Gilded Great Shield, an item that would really help me out. Now I just had to get it. This was a pretty time-consuming process that involved me farming the one Godric Knight that had it at the Gatefront Ruins. While farming for this, he happened to drop the Partisan, which was pretty lucky, and I wound up pairing it with the shield. But yeah, eventually I did get the Great Shield. The main reason I wanted this was for the high guard boost. It had a guard boost of 69, nice. For context, my starter heater shield only had a guard boost of 49. This might not seem like a huge jump at a glance, but it's actually massive in terms of reducing stamina cost for each block. I slapped on the Barricade Shield skill, level up my spear to +2, and I was ready to go. Margit, round 3. When used on a great shield like this, Barricade Shield almost completely negates the stamina loss from blocking attacks. Even on the biggest hits, I'd only lose the smallest fraction of my stamina. With this, I did the occasional guard counter, but my main form of offense was poking Margit from behind my shield. In case you didn't know, all thrusting weapons can be used while blocking. This meant I could stay safe while getting damage in. This wasn't foolproof though. Stamina was still an issue, since even if Barricade Shield was up, my stamina would also go down from attacking, and I needed to put my shield down to recover stamina since there's a huge penalty to its recovery speed while blocking. And all of this is on top of the other stamina penalty that came from my equip load being so high. Also, even if I blocked everything, I was still taking consistent chip damage from Margit's elemental attacks. My shield had 100% defense against physical damage, but only 65% for holy damage, so a number of his attacks still hurt quite a bit, especially in phase 2 where he uses elemental moves more frequently. The other obvious problem is that whenever I needed to heal, I couldn't just run away and create distance. I needed to heal right in his face and hope for the best. One more thing, I figured out that I could actually do a small recovery roll whenever an attack knocked me onto my back. Whenever you're in this state, you can tap dodge to roll and get back on your feet, and lucky for me, this works even past the maximum equip load. There were a couple times I used this to avoid attacks that would have otherwise hit me, because you're still vulnerable to damage when lying on the ground. The hardest part was always in phase 2, when he would just combo again and again, but after 5 tries, I finally got him. First boss down. Next up was Stormveil Castle. I had 2 options to get through it, the side path or the main gate. Of course, I was going to go with the side path. Dealing with the ballistas on the main gate while walking seemed like a nightmare. So I went through the side entrance and immediately hit a ledge that I needed to jump on to progress. Oh no. Main path it is, fuck it. Without Barricade Shield, my guard was broken immediately by the bolts, and I'd get sent flying back. With Barricade Shield though, there was hope. The stamina loss was pretty negligible, but the issue was that anytime I blocked, I was stuck in place unable to move. Then I also had to contend with a couple enemies running up to me while I was fighting for my life with the ballistas. Then I reached the point where I needed to walk backwards to reach the site of grace nearby. To do this, I purposefully left one of the enemies alive so that I could lock onto him while backing up and blocking. It was a little tricky, but I got it. The first hurdle had been cleared. From here, I went back out and began the process of taking out each enemy. The first few I killed with my spear, but then I realized it was time to break out my shortbow. I bought this earlier from a merchant and was just holding off on using it until it felt especially necessary. This bow allowed me to pick off the enemies one by one so I wouldn't get swarmed and overwhelmed. I got to the next checkpoint by sneaking past the giant lion, and then I went back to continue along the path into the castle. The next part had me worried. I tried shooting at the guards that shoot explosive bolts, but they weren't in view before I was within range of getting shot at. And unlike the ballistas from the previous section, they were firing from multiple angles, so I couldn't block them all at once. Incredibly, despite this, I haphazardly made it up the stairs on my first attempt. I was getting tossed around the whole time, yet somehow fumbled through it. All that was left was the courtyard filled with even more enemies. I took out every one of them while primarily relying on my bow so I could be safe about it. I started with 99 arrows and used every single one. The last hazard was the big guy with his dog, but I just snuck around them by sticking to the right. The next checkpoint had been reached. I went up the elevator and I made it to the entrance of Godric's boss room. Godric time. His fight was kind of similar to Margit's in the sense that phase 1 was physical attacks that I could deal with easily, but phase 2 had a lot more elemental attacks that posed some issues for my setup. The real problem though was his grab attack during phase 2. Whenever you're standing in front of him, he loves to use his dragon head to grab you and breathe fire. Grab attacks are unblockable, and without the ability to dodge, I was forced to tank it. Fortunately, the damage on this attack was only about half of my health bar, so I could just deal with it. I just had to get good RNG and hope that he would use other moves. I'll spare you the details for the whole fight, but it essentially came down to good timing on when to use Barricade Shield, when to heal, and when to recover stamina. I got him on my 5th try. With Godric down, I had made it into Liurnia. I wasn't ready to explore it yet though. I first had things to do in Limgrave and Caelid. I went to Summonwater Village and entered the underground area. After walking past a few dogs, I picked up a talisman that boosted my stamina recovery speed. It's not the biggest boost, but I had an empty talisman slot, so it couldn't hurt. From here, I started walking east into Caelid. At first, I thought I wasn't going to be able to enter from this side due to the wall at the entrance. I was like, maybe this is a clever way of making sure you get your horse before accidentally entering, but no, there's actually a small gap to the right. I then slowly worked my way through Caelid toward Redmane Castle. I did my best to avoid most encounters along the way by staying off the road whenever there were enemies nearby. Eventually I arrived at the bridge leading into the castle. Not even Barricade Shield could save me from this one. There were 2 catapults launching flaming boulders at me, and the result was me dying pretty quickly. Luckily, I didn't actually need to cross the bridge to get into the castle. In case you didn't know, Redmane Castle has 2 different states. Its normal state and the Radahn Festival state. There are a couple different ways to unlock the Radahn fight, but the easiest one is by reaching the Altus Plateau after using the Grand Lift of Dectus. To do this, I needed both halves of the Dectus Medallion. The first half was easy enough to get. It's just at the top of this fort in Limgrave. The second half was less easy for this type of playthrough. It was at the top of Fort Faroth, right next to where I was earlier for the Screaming Dragon in Caelid. The problem is that there were quite a few giant bat enemies in the way. Normally I'd just run past them to the ladder, but I couldn't do that here. And killing them was also a bit complicated because they had a grab move that I couldn't avoid that would instantly kill me. I was stuck here for longer than you might think. I managed to consistently kill the first couple giant bats from a distance with my bow, but the real issue came from the second half of the room where there were multiple of the human-faced giant bats. These were even stronger than the other bats, and oftentimes I would aggro more than one at a time by accident. This meant death every time since they also had the same grab attack. After many attempts, here was my solution. I took out the first 2 giant bats, and then just had the 3 remaining strong ones. Instead of killing them, I decided to try stealth. They were all spread out and looking in different directions, so it seemed possible. The first one could be avoided by just hugging the right wall. The second one in the back left wasn't even looking toward me, so that was easy, but the third one in the back right was looking directly at the path toward the ladder. I dealt with this by very carefully shooting an arrow at the wall next to this enemy. It turned toward it to investigate the sound, and I used this small window of time to walk to the ladder. By the time it turned around and saw me, I was close enough to the safety of the ladder. I got poisoned, but it didn't matter. I made it and got the second half of the medallion. Before heading back to Liurnia to use the medallion, I wanted to get a better weapon. I was still just using the +2 partisan. I went to the Round Table Hold and received Rogier's rapier after talking to Rogier. This weapon starts at +8 and is a thrusting weapon, so I could keep using it from behind my shield. I also put the Bloody Slash Ash of War on it for bleed damage. However, it required 17 dexterity and I only had 13. Instead of just leveling a few times, I thought it'd be more interesting to take out Commander O'Neill, my favorite boss to cheese. Doing this would allow me to get the gold needle that I could give to Millicent so I could get the +5 dexterity talisman from her. In the past, I'd beaten him by jumping up the roots to fire arrows from safety, and I was really curious if this would still be possible without jumping and without a horse. I scanned the perimeter of his area and eventually found a spot that looked promising. Believe it or not, this worked. I slowly made my way up the roots to get into position. It took a bit of patience, but I got him stuck in the perfect spot below me. Standing on the edge of a small branch, I fired poison arrows at him while doing my best to ignore the archers that were shooting at me. After a few minutes, I got him. Could I have just fought him normally? Yes, but this was more fun. So I went to Millicent, got the dexterity talisman, and I could now use the rapier. All that remained before Radahn was for me to get to the Grand Lift of Dectus. I began my journey walking through Liurnia. This was slow and gave me time to think about life. How did the world get this way? What are we all doing? Why didn't Miyazaki put any actual mimic chests in the game? Anyway, I grabbed the glintstone key from behind the dragon on the lake, used it to enter Rey Lucaria, and then went out the alternate entrance to reach the northern part of Liurnia. From here, I just had to keep going north. I was able to avoid most of the enemies on the path here by keeping to the edges and using stealth. I then made it to the lift, entered the Altus Plateau, snuck past the giants, and walked up the hill nearby to reach the site of grace. I teleported back to the bridge at Redmane Castle, and I could finally enter through the portal nearby. Time for Radahn, here we go. So immediately, we got a problem. His arrows sent me flying back even when I blocked them. I would get sent back 5 feet for every 6 feet that I walked. This was too much. It was time to make use of another tool I had been ignoring up until now, the Quick Step skill. This is the default skill on the dagger, and it would allow me to move around quickly while still having an overloaded equip load. I was aware of this as an option from the start, but I thought it'd be more interesting if I didn't rely on it. It felt more in the spirit of the run to not use it and be forced to walk, so I only wanted to use it for scenarios like this where there wasn't really an alternative. My plan was pretty simple though. Use Quick Step to move around the arena, summon all the NPCs, and then inflict Scarlet Rot with the rot arrows I crafted to deal damage. Fighting Radahn up close was simply not going to work with how aggressive he was. I tried this at first, but it went poorly. Anyway, once I inflicted Scarlet Rot, I immediately booked it to the edge of the arena to let it do its damage while the summons continued to fight. This took a few tries, but I eventually got him down to a little over half health by the time the Rot ran out and the last summon died. This allowed me to send him into his second phase while we were both near the edge. And then... Genuinely one of the most satisfying boss kills I've ever gotten. I can't believe this actually works. With Radahn dead, my next destination was the city of Leyndell, but I wanted to grab a couple items before I went over there. First, I went to the Lakeside Crystal Cave to get the Spear Talisman. This boosts the counter damage on thrusting weapons by around 20%. This is a somewhat hidden mechanic, so I'll explain it real quick. Basically, all thrusting attacks get a 20% damage boost if they hit an enemy while they're in the middle of an attack. Given my strategy of hiding behind my shield while I poke enemies, this meant I was frequently getting this damage boost, and the Spear Talisman would boost it even further. The second item I wanted to get was the Great Shield Talisman. Unfortunately, it was located in the back of a carriage that required me to jump to get up. I really wanted this item though, and the game, seemingly sensing my willpower, let me get up by walking on the wheels of the side. I got it. With this item, the guard boost on my shield would be raised by 10%. From here, I began my trek over to Leyndell. This actually wasn't trivial because I was still committed to walking everywhere. Like I said before, I wanted to save the use of Quick Step solely for bosses where I felt it was absolutely necessary. The first obstacle was the 2 tree sentinels at the top of the stairs leading into Eastern Altus. I figured my best bet was just to avoid them, so I went to the left of the stairs. I had a close encounter with a giant bear, and then I reached a pile of rocks blocking my way forward. I thought I was going to be stuck here, but I found just the right spot that would let me up if I attacked. Then I snuck past the tree sentinels. Next, I again stayed to the left as I went up the hill to avoid the giant gargoyle that appears, and then I approached the giant archers further ahead. It was kind of funny just staring them down while they shot at me. Overall, not an issue to get past though. And then, the last hurdle before Leyndell was the Draconic Tree Sentinel. My plan was pretty straightforward. Shoot him a few times with some arrows to inflict Scarlet Rot, then block and poke. The main thing worth noting here is that with the addition of the Great Shield Talisman, Barricade Shield now completely negated all stamina loss from blocking. So yeah, pretty easy fight. I'd made it into Leyndell. Walking through the city was interesting. I usually just ran past most enemies and jumped across rooftops, but this time I took it slow. The most noteworthy roadblock was the Erdtree avatar that appeared, and my solution for dealing with it was shooting arrows, walking away to wait for him to lose aggro, and then shooting more arrows. This took 15 minutes and was a bit of a struggle. It went from afternoon to night, as you can see. I got the checkpoint, killed the knights nearby, and got a lucky golden great shield drop. Its guard boost was 1 point higher than my old shield, so why not? Next, I worked my way to the houses below and picked up Lionel's armor set, a nice upgrade for my starting gear. Now that I have some new armor, this seems like a good time to briefly go over how defense and damage absorption works. This number is your defense and this number is your damage absorption. The first one is determined by your stats and the second one is determined by armors and buffs. Here's a simple example to show how the damage you take is calculated. Let's say an enemy has an attack with a damage value of 300 and your defense is 150 with a damage absorption of 30. The defense value is used as a flat reduction right off the top, so 300 minus 150. That remaining 150 damage is then reduced again by damage absorption, which acts as a percentage. So you take 30% of 150, which is 45, and then subtract that from 150. Thus that 300 damage attack only deals 105 damage after taking these reductions into account. If any of that made you zone out, just know that bigger armor equals less damage. Anyway, I kept making progress as I began my ascent up the giant dragon wing. I was a little concerned that I would need to jump to get up, but no, the inclines never got that steep. Even at the very end, there still wasn't any jumping necessary. For a moment, it felt like FromSoft developed this level with my pointless run in mind. The Spirit of Godfrey was up next, and in preparation for this fight, I removed the bleed damage from my weapon since he was immune to it. And then I proceeded to beat him on my first try. Bosses that dealt 100% physical damage were pretty much a non-threat with this setup, and Godfrey's the perfect example of this. Easy kill. Morgott was up next. This fight started out similar to Margit's with a bit of elemental chip damage, but phase 2 was notably harder. The elemental damage was cranked up even more, and he had a grab attack that was devastating. If the grab attack itself didn't kill me, his follow-up after always would. My solution was to get tankier, so I crafted some Iron Jar aromatics using the crafting book from the Oriza side tomb just outside the city. These boosted my physical damage absorption by 40% for 40 seconds, bringing my total physical damage absorption to about 60%. I also switched from Rogier's rapier to the Cleanrot Knight's sword, which drops from Cleanrot Knights. This is basically just a straight upgrade with higher base damage and longer reach. If you're wondering why I decided to stick with the thrusting sword weapon class instead of something like a spear or a great spear, it's because thrusting swords are faster and consume less stamina. These two things seemed useful for helping manage my stamina, which was still a major concern during all boss encounters. I think it was also useful for inflicting bleed more quickly. I also brought out the Rot arrows again to inflict Scarlet Rot at the start of the fight while Morgott was on the other side of the arena. I figured this would help me minimize my time spent in phase 2 if I was fast enough in phase 1 and the Scarlet Rot was still active. All this together worked like a charm. Morgott was defeated. The next area I needed to go to was the Forbidden Lands, but I first made a stop in the sewers of Leyndell. The reason I was here was so I could get the Fingerprint Stone Shield, the strongest great shield in the game. It was located at the very bottom of the zone. Things were going smoothly enough as I was traversing the area until I hit this spot right here. It was a ledge I needed to jump up to, and this was the only way forward to reach the elevator that would take me down to the bottom. Instead of calling it quits, I decided to attempt some online shenanigans. I summoned a friend to help me glitch my way down. If you parry someone next to a ledge and then initiate the riposte right as you begin to fall off the side, you can use the iframes from the riposte animation to survive the fall. I did this, but the fall to the bottom was just a little bit too long and I didn't make it. So I gave up for now. Back to the main path. In the Forbidden Lands, I was hit with another roadblock, a gap. My first idea was to try quick stepping off the ledge, but that didn't work. Was it time to break out the horse? Not yet. I had another idea. What about the Lion's Claw skill on the Claymore? This is a move that launches you forward in the air. But would it work for gaps? Yep, it worked perfectly, and I used it again for the next gap too. Another tool for the tool belt. I didn't feel like dealing with the Blackblade Kindred, so I walked past him and made it to the lift to take me to the mountaintops of the Giants. And here I hit another platforming related roadblock on this narrow stone bridge. There was this one spot that was just a little too high. The Lion's Claw couldn't save me here. So for the first time, I took out my horse to help me jump up. I wasn't happy that I had to do this, but I couldn't think of anything else. As I continued along the bridge, the giant began shooting at me. His aim was pretty terrible though, and it was only once I got close that I even needed to start blocking. In my head, I thought this part was going to be harder, so I was a little disappointed. Next up was the frozen lake with the ice dragon. I attempted going around to the left and right to avoid it spawning, but that didn't seem possible. Blocking his ice breath also went pretty badly, so I said screw it and just used quick step to avoid him. I knew the next boss was going to be a nightmare, and I didn't want to get burnt out on the dragon before him. Speaking of the next boss, here he is, the fire giant. I hate this guy. He has over 40,000 health. The first thing I learned was that some of his attacks were unblockable, like his overhead slam. I guess it makes sense since it's coming from above, but this meant relying on my shield simply wasn't going to work, so I decided to use quick step instead. Before doing any more attempts though, I made a quick detour to the Volcano Manor so I could do Patch's questline. My journey to get there was pretty uneventful. Totally didn't die or anything. Anyway, I eventually made it inside. Then I killed this guy, then this guy, then this guy, and my reward was the Bull Goat armor set. This has the highest damage absorption and poise in the game, and now felt like the right time to use it. Back to the fire giant. Even with quick step, this fight sucked. He moves around and runs away so often, so I just had to keep quick stepping after him like a hyperactive frog. I managed to get phase 1 down pretty consistently, but phase 2 was pure pain. Anytime I got close, he'd do some AoE fire move that killed me every time. If it didn't kill me outright, I'd get comboed into another attack from off screen. Okay, fair enough. My natural response to this was to try and keep my distance. So my idea was to bring out the rot arrows again. This was a bit tricky to pull off, but I managed to proc Scarlet Rot and then quick stepped away. By the way, I was getting shot by fireballs this entire time, and that was also not fun. My hope was that Scarlet Rot would be enough to kill him. It was not. I tried finishing him off, and he hit me with the fire breath. Awesome. I even tried getting a second thrusting sword for extra DPS once I realized I was hardly using my shield. I kept trying for another hour, but this still wasn't enough. Could someone better than me do this? For sure, but they're not the one making this video, so I conceded to using something that would make this easier. My options were to use my horse or summon Alexander. My thought was that using the horse would make this fight no different than a normal playthrough, so I went with the more interesting option of Alexander. I'd never really given him a chance on my other playthroughs, to be honest. The fact that summoning him disabled my horse was enough to put me off, but I wasn't going to use my horse, so hey, why not? Yeah, turns out that Alexander fucking rules. When he hits hard. We're talking several thousand damage. He's pretty tanky too. And fun fact, because he's summoned from inside of the arena, he doesn't increase the health of the boss like all other NPCs do when summoned. My plan was to fight with him for phase 1 and then let him do most of the work for phase 2. This unfortunately wasn't panning out. He's tanky, but not that tanky, and he kept dying before getting too far into phase 2. And then it hit me. His summon sign is inside of the boss room, and that meant I could summon him at any point during the fight, like, for example, just phase 2. That way he'd have his entire health pool for just that portion of the fight. So that's exactly what I did. I got the Fire Giant to phase 2 on my own, quick step to the entrance of the arena, summoned Alexander, and then let him solo the boss while I stood back and fired rot arrows. It was awesome to watch, and it made me love Alexander even more. What a king. It came down to the wire. They both just had a little bit of health left. I stood back to let Alexander have this win. He had earned it. Tragedy struck. Alexander didn't survive, but I wouldn't let his death be in vain. Fire Giant down. Next, it was on to Fair Missoula. I was a little concerned about the platforming here. Since it was a floating city in the sky, I knew there was potential for a required jump that might end the run outright. Fortunately, that wasn't the case, at least for the first half of the area, and I made it to the Godskin duo with no issue. As for the fight itself, there's not a lot to say. I used sleep arrows, so I only had to fight one at a time for most of the fight. The black flame attacks were an issue, but I was tanky enough to just deal with it, and I got them after 6 tries. After the fight, I lion clawed my way over to this body to grab the Dragon Crest Shield Talisman +2. This provided a nice boost to my physical damage absorption. I kept chugging along, everything was going well, and then I hit it. A ledge right after all the birds and before the dragon. I was stuck. I did not make it this far into the game to have my run ended by a chest-high ledge. Surely I was forgetting something that could help me out, right? What about the ground slam skill? The one where you jump up in the air and slam enemies with your ass. This had actually been available from the start in Limgrave. So I grabbed it, went back, and yep, it works for jumping up ledges. The run was still alive. After getting the next checkpoint, I also immediately went back to the ledge on the stone bridge in the mountains so I could prove that my one time using the horse wasn't actually necessary. So taking that into account, this is still technically a no horse run. Then I went back to the sewers so I could get past the ledge down there too. I hopped over the ledge, hopped into the pipe, and then took the elevator down. Next I fought Mog, and I'll spare you the details. I'm sure you get the whole blocking and poking thing by now. At the back of his arena, there's a secret passage that you can reveal by attacking, and I know at least one person watching this right now is having their mind blown. This secret area contains the hardest platforming section in the game, and I had to do it without being able to run or jump properly. It was painful. Eventually though, I mastered the butt slam, and I used it to navigate to the alcove near the bottom. There I got my reward, the fingerprint shield. This bad boy has a guard boost of 90 when fully upgraded. It's a monster of a great shield with high elemental resistances too. To demonstrate how good it is, let's look at the next boss, Malekith. Combined with the Great Shield Talisman, the Barricade Shield skill was no longer necessary. Just with the shield by itself and no other skill, I lost 0 stamina from even the biggest attacks. It's absurd. Naturally, Phase 1 was a complete non-issue. Phase 2 more than made up for that though. Here, Malekith has black flame attacks that drain my health, lowered my max HP, and could go through shields. On top of that, the health drain effect could stack to the point where my health would just plummet. I died a lot. Could I have chosen to use Quickstep or gotten the Blasphemous Claw item to stun him? Yes, but I was intrigued by the challenge that's posed without those. Here I was, ridiculously strong with this new Great Shield, and the one real counter was Malekith. It seemed like fun. This took a couple dozen tries, but I managed to do this with Warming Stones to help offset the health drain, as well as with strategic positioning with the pillars in the arena to help block some of the elemental attacks. I also just gave myself as much health as I could with HP Talismans and Morgoth's Great Rune. And I got him. Malekith down. Next up was Gideon, and yeah, I got him first try. Nothing really to say here. This fight was a brief window into how annoying Great Shields can be in PvP. Next was Godfrey. For the sake of variety, I decided to change up my strategy. What if instead of relying on my Great Shield, I tank through everything? To do this, I used the Great Star's Great Hammer and equipped the Prayerful Strike Ash of War. This weapon comes with a built-in ability that restores 1% of your total HP for every hit you land, but the real star of the show is Prayerful Strike. This move restores a whopping 30% of your total HP whenever it hits, and because that's a percentage rather than a flat amount, that means that the longer your HP bar, the more health you'll get. At 2500 health, I was recovering 750 HP per swing. Then, all I had to do was pair this with my armor, defense boosting talismans, and Iron Jar aromatics, and I had around 70% physical damage absorption. The poise from the armor and the Iron Jar aromatics helped me not get staggered too often, and the healing Prayerful Strike provided was more than enough to offset the damage. Unfortunately, in Phase 2, Godfrey loves to use lots of grab attacks, and my strategy stopped being effective. I wound up getting him by switching back to my bleed sword, getting a lucky stance break at the beginning of Phase 2, and then finishing him off with bleed damage before he had time to grab me too much. All that was left now was Radagon and Elden Beast. Since this run had evolved into a sort of Great Shield showcase, I figured it was only fitting to take Radagon down with the Fingerprint Stone Shield and nothing else. I put the Shield Crash skill on my shield, and I transformed into a 500-pound bulldozer. Not only is the damage output from this wild, but it blocks attacks at the same time. My only concern was Radagon's grab attack and some of his bigger holy moves. This wasn't enough to stop the Great Shield pain train though. As for Elden Beast, I really did try to commit to a shield only kill, but he ran around way too much for that. It's awful. This is tedious enough on a normal playthrough, so just imagine having to walk everywhere. Therefore, for the sake of my own sanity, I brought out the quick step. This was still a pretty time-consuming process, but in the end, I finished him off. And there you go. You can beat Elden Ring while over the maximum equip load. I'm not done though. I wanted to fully demonstrate how devastating the Great Shield and Thrusting Weapon combo can be, and what better way to show that than on the hardest boss in the game, Malenia. I literally just stood there and poked. With my bleed weapon and the talisman that boosts damage after proccing bleed, I was able to easily outpace her healing, and whenever she got in position to do her waterfowl dance move, I just threw a freezing pot at her. This cancels the move, so if you're struggling with this fight yourself, this is a game changer. In Phase 2, I did have to use Quickstep to avoid the initial dive bomb, but after that it was back to business as usual with more blocking and poking. A bit of patience, and and I got her. So there you go. That's Elden Ring while your equip load is overloaded. What began as a challenge run morphed into a showcase on the effectiveness of great shields, thrusting weapons, and heavy armor. It was fun having to deal with problems that simply weren't issues in a normal playthrough, and I appreciate that the flexibility and build variety of FromSoft games allows for shenanigans like this to be possible. Thank you very much for watching. Hey, so I only mentioned it for like 10 seconds at the beginning, so I'm just going to spend the rest of the video going over my merch briefly. First of all, here it is in real life. If you're curious what it looks like, my friend Maria, aka EuroThug4000, was kind enough to model it for me. And yeah, I'm really satisfied with how it came out, both with the quality of the prints as well as the material of the clothing itself. Also, huge thank you to Chu for doing the design. Chu is one of my favorite artists, just in general, and I highly recommend you follow them. Go check them out, I'll link them below. As for the design itself, I wanted something that wasn't like YouTuber branded merch, you know? I wanted something that was just kind of like fun and cool and that I would actually wear, you know? Like, I'm actually wearing this. Anyway, I just wanted to make something that was fun and I thought people would genuinely like to wear and get for themselves. But that's gonna do it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.